Okay, well, hey, we're here today and we are doing video in legal context. And so let me remind you, I'm Rob Dawalt, and this is my email address, robdawalt@me.com. What we're working on today is regulation of businesses. And then executive, compensation. Now, the important thing is on regulation that really, I want to talk a little bit about history here. Because in terms of regulation, in the early going, in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was totally unregulated. There were no unions. There were basically no rules. There was a system called Laissez-Faire, which is to say, it's French for, and I'm not sure that I spelled that right. I think these might be S's. Let the buyer beware. Let the buyer beware. Okay? And what that really meant is you buy anything, you buy it at your own risk. Okay? And so then what ended up happening is in the 1890s, there was what we call a period of what we call muckraking journalism. Okay? And maybe some of you heard about that in your history class or something like that. And in the form of muckraking, what they're always talking about is terrible working conditions. There was no OSHA back then, for example. Child labor laws did not exist. 12-year-old children very commonly working in mills. A lot of times young children worked in coal mines because they could get in the cracks and crevices and they could actually assist in picking up small pieces of coal and things like that. So they got the best productivity out of every mine. And so under this muckraking, Ida Tarbell, for example, was one of the writers, and she decried the conditions. I mentioned, I think, somewhere in the part that I did about unions, about Mother Jones from West Virginia was another one, was very active in promoting the plight of the working class and how they needed more rights and so forth. So this is kind of the precursor for OSHA. Then we saw developments like workers' compensation in the early 1900s up to about between 1910 and 1920, where workers were given money and were not allowed to sue their company, but they were given money in exchange for a settlement if they get hurt at work or even killed at work. A lot of people were getting killed at work at those times. Well, so this was the beginnings of the early seeds of a lot of regulation, and so this regulation then spread into a number of other areas. Some of the things that we see that are more heavily regulated today include banking, the banking industry, the stock market, and so over time, a lot of these major industries have developed a period where they were heavily regulated. And this includes the telephone company, the light company, all the power companies, the railroads, the airplanes. Because you need to have a safe system of transportation, and so the overarching safety concerns by the government is the reason why they believe that they have a duty and a right to regulate private businesses. So we have kind of a push-pull going on in this country. There is a want to keep people safe on the one hand, and this is also true in other areas like crime and terrorism. And so, we want to have these scales. This is safety, so we want to be safe, but we also want to be free at the same time, and it's hard to do that. It's hard to work that where you can have everything in terms of equilibrium. If you get so anxious about safety, safety goes down, but this means that freedom goes up. And so in other words, you got more freedom, less safety, more safety, less freedom, So, as it goes, that's kind of the trade-off. It's just a pure trade-off between these two conditions in our society. And a lot of people, when asked in our society today, actually fully 50%, if you just ask them, say that there's too much regulation in our business and industry today. 50% believe that. But then we see what happened with Bernie Madoff, could we have regulated him a little better and prevented him from getting away with what he got away with in terms of white-collar crime? It's a good question. If we'd have done a better job maybe of auditing, we might have gotten that stopped before it even happened. Another thing is that we have other areas where we've had, like in the airline industry, a number of different things like that savings and loan industry. Ronald Reagan, for example, in the 80s made a major shift toward freedom, trying to say, less regulation on business, and so it caused a lot of growth in business and things like that, but it had adverse outcomes in some areas in terms of the banking, the savings and loan scandal that they had in the plain states like in Kansas and some Oklahoma, some places like that. And that guy's name was Keating, I believe. So, there's almost like a push-pull that if it's less safe, it's more free, but if it's more free, if it's more safe, it's less free, if you understand what I'm trying to say in an inartful way, and I apologize for that. And so the whole thing of this is that the thought is that the government has a duty to protect the consumer. Okay, make the consumer more safe. So the government steps in to make the consumer more safe, okay? And so if you make it like completely safe, cradle to grave like safe, then you're talking about socialized. So in other words, what happens is, extreme example, China, some of the Scandinavian countries, they own car manufacturing, coal mining. They've just taken over completely, and they run these different industries. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, nobody gets full days productivity for a full day's pay, because everybody's like, well, everything's so regulated, I can't make a profit, I don't have a free hand here. So free markets, free capital, theoretically at least, if you have the freedom to innovate, try new things, and change technology, change techniques that you use to make things, then you basically can make a lot more money and you'll be more productive, and so it's more profitable, full employment, all these things. You can force full employment on society like Russia tried to do. Problem with it was that productivity went way down. So you have full employment, you get low productivity if you force it, whereas if the free market takes control and they can try new things and they develop a new technology or a new technique, then productivity goes way up, and then employment goes up, because you teach people how to do this new technique or technology, and up it goes. So in a way, it's almost self-defeating, that if you're trying to protect the consumer too much, it actually stifles productivity and new ideas. But if you don't protect the consumer enough, then although you have like a free hand to do basically whatever you want to do. The problem with that, though, is that it gets risky. People are taking chances. They're trying to make shortcuts. You start making shortcuts, what ends up happening, people start cheating, actually literally stealing from people, or the whole process is unsafe, like you build an unsafe bridge because there's no bridge inspector, for example. Someone tries to drive across it and they die, okay? So this is the kind of thing we're looking at. When we're looking at safety, this is safety from theft, this is safety from being killed. When we're looking at freedom, this is freedom in banking, freedom in airplanes, freedom in, production of locomotives, banking, stocks, just about anything, the power companies, and all this type thing. So what we found is, for example, if we have the totally free system in the electric company, let's just go with that for a quick, neat example. Electric company, where would electric companies go if it was totally free system? Well, the electric companies would stay in New York City, Los Angeles. Why? Well, the more people you have, the more money you make. The more electricity you make, you have a ready customer, the customer buys it, and so everything's good to go. Well, what about Tennessee? You get these people live miles and miles apart. Montana, Wyoming, they live way far away from everybody. Well, who's going to take electricity to those people? Well, you can approach this two different ways. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which is a strictly government-owned corporation that provides electricity to people in rural parts of Tennessee and Kentucky, okay? Or you can have what we have up in Indiana, we have what we call REMC, which is Rural Electric Cooperatives. And so what you end up having is groups that band together that need electricity, companies, farmers, people, and so they all kind of go together, form a board, and find a way to acquire electricity. So that's a private approach, but it is a nonprofit cooperative approach to providing service that is needed, which is electricity. So two different approaches. It's not profitable any way you go about it. About the time you figure out a way to make it profitable, then some private company is going to swoop in and want to buy it, which is okay because that's a free market system. But as far as going out on a limb and saying, well, I'm going to provide electricity to these people that live 50 miles from anywhere, it's not going to probably happen unless the government steps in. So you can see the need for requirements to have the government involved to a certain extent, but you've got to figure out how to try to achieve that balance. You're never going to achieve the balance. You're going to try to get as close to it as you can. And so there are a number of different ways that the government has tried to strike that balance. Of course, I've mentioned the Securities and Exchange Commission. Basically, they had a thing called the Glass-Steagall Act where they were trying to regulate banks. Problem with that became that it became so onerous that it wasn't profitable to own banks. So what ended up happening, they did away with the Glass-Steagall Act, and so there was less regulation on banks. The problem with that, though, is it's the very kind of thing that led up to a Bernie Madoff type situation. Yes, freedom went up of regulation on banks, but there's a lot of elderly people that lost their life savings because of some of these things that we tried. So, these are important. There are still many consumer protection acts, also called the Todd Frank Act, that is trying to reform Wall Street. Also, Financial Stability Oversight Council that tries to prevent mortgage fraud, which what that is that people will get maybe a false appraisal of their home, a lot higher than the house is really worth, get these out-of-town banks to lend money on it, and then what ends up happening, the guy goes bankrupt, the bank is holding an empty sack because that house maybe is worth $70,000, it has a $125,000 mortgage on it, and you can repeat that hundreds of times all over the United States. And so there's a number of these different things that go on. So any kind of regulatory type work that's done is somehow traced back to this basic equation that we have here, is trying to find that right balance between freedom and safety of the consumer and public. Okay? Well, the other thing we have up on here is the executive compensation. I don't plan on talking about that quite as much because really, in a free country, we're allowed basically to, pay what we want, and we can hire and fire who we want. The problem that you get into on that sometimes, though, there are exceptions that develop that require some form of regulation. So some guys, for example, that are, let's say, CEO of a company, they get a zero salary, okay, zero salary. And you can see examples of that when we look at this week, and I've already posted some examples of that. But they get a performance bonus, okay? And what do we really mean by performance bonus, okay? Because, sometimes it's just a flat percentage of GDP. So what's that? The business develops a certain gross domestic product, which is to say they generate profits, okay? If the business is profitable, then they get a percentage of these profits, okay? And sometimes that percentage, it's like $3 billion a year. I mean, it's just a fantastic amount of money. People say, well, that's obscene, it's terrible. But what can you do? I mean, because people on the board, they're supposed to represent the interest of the stockholders, they approved it. So the guys are getting that. Now, some other people have said, well, there has to be, if there's a performance bonus, it needs to be a percentage of a base sum. So basically, let's say that the company made $15 billion. Okay, note to self, I need to get a different marker because both these markers are running out of gas. So let's say that it's been averaging for 5 years, it's been averaging $15 billion profit a year, okay? So then what did the CEO do to generate those profits? Basically nothing. He didn't do anything. They were getting $15 billion before the guy ever got there. So why should that guy get a percentage bonus on that? So let us say it's like everything over 15, he gets a certain bonus, okay? So that would bring this compensation down. And that would also make some shareholders happier, because if you don't give that money to the CEO, where does the money go? It goes to the shareholder. And so that's what we call dividends, okay? So if you have a lower bonus to the executive, you get a higher dividend to the shareholder. Now you have a method of trying to protest the CEO that gets this huge performance bonus, and that is what we call a shareholders derivative suit. So I'm going to put that up here next so that you can put this in your notes. Shareholder derivative suit, and what that is that the shareholders have to come together, and that's not, not all of them, but enough, a large quantity, and what that means is that they sue the board, the CEO, and the corporation, and they say, I'm not getting high enough dividend, I want a higher dividend, and they're keeping the profits too close to the chest, and we want to lower bonuses in order to raise the dividends, And so the court can look at this and say, well, is the shareholder right, or is the board and the CEO right? I mean, as far as which one's which. And so they might kind of rule, well, they're both a little right and they're both a little bit wrong, because they are kind of engaged in, maybe pie in the sky type argument that, every other industry like this out there is paying a similar bonus to their people, their CEO, their COO, people like that. And so it's foolish to think that the stockholders are going to change that culture. And so a lot of times what they'll say is they don't consider some of these things to be any kind of an abomination or obnoxious, because it's a kind of an industry standard. We've heard those words before, and it comes into play here. Industry standard. So if that's a standard pay that someone makes in this industry, then it's probably going to be approved, okay? But on the other hand, depending on what other companies are paying for the same type of work, the same kind of outcomes, then probably it's not going to fly. The court will probably say, no, compensation is way too high. But here again, we go back to the issue of, should the court, which is a form of government, stick its nose into a private corporation and regulate how they pay their employees? Because in a free market, if the shareholders don't like it, take your money, move on, put your money somewhere else, because you don't like the way that that's going. You're not required to be an investor in that corporation. So that's the argument. So there's a lot of different back and forth on this, but I think basically thinking in terms of those scales is a good idea in a lot of contexts, whether it's in crime, whether it's in terrorism, whether it's in regulation of industry. You're going to see those scales a lot. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have questions, problems, let me know. I'll be here. You can always email me, and I'll respond to you as quickly as possible. Thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon.